Hi, hello everyone. My name is Vivek. I am a software developer. I make videos about Kubernetes, containers, Go as a programming language, and sometimes about software engineering in general. So in this particular video, we are going to look into what are Kubernetes Ingress resources and why do we actually use them in Kubernetes. So Ingress resources are like any other Kubernetes resource. For example, pod, daemon set, deployment, or any other resource that we know of, right? And Kubernetes Ingress resources are actually used to expose your application outside of the cluster. So, for example, let's say you have deployed an application, right? An API or anything, and you want that application to be accessed from outside of the cluster, or in other words, let's say you want to expose that application from outside of the cluster. These are the scenarios where you can consider using Kubernetes Ingress resources, right? Now, there are some other resources that can be used to expose your application outside of the cluster. For example, you can create services of type, let's say, load balancer or of type NodePort, and in that case, you can actually access your application from outside of the cluster, right? So those are some other ways, but there are some reasons because of which we actually prefer Ingress resources instead of NodePort or load balancer Kubernetes services, right? And we are going to look into those differences in a bit. So I already have a Kubernetes cluster set up here, Kubernetes three node cluster on DigitalOcean, and this is the cluster that we are going to use for this particular session, I would say. So now we know that we can either use service of type, let's say, NodePort, or of type load balancer, right, to expose our application outside of the cluster, right? And things work as expected, but there are some other benefits of using ingresses over NodePort or load balancer services, right? So if we talk about benefits that Ingress provides us with, so for example, let's say you want to have path-based routing, right? When I say path-based routing, what I actually mean is, let's say if request is coming to, let's say, APIs slash v1 slash books, right? If a request is coming onto this particular resource path, let's say you want to redirect that request to a particular service named v1 service, right? But if a request is coming to APIs slash v2 slash books, in that case, let's say you want to redirect that request to another service, right? That is v2 books. So this is one benefit that we have over NodePort and load balancer services, right? So we call this path-based routing. I'm not very sure if this is a standard term, but I think we can call it path-based routing, because this is the resource path, right? And based on that path, we are deciding which particular service the request should go to, right? Similarly, the other benefit that we have is ingresses can also act as load balancers, right? Again, load balancer is pretty generic term, so maybe you can look up how we can use ingresses using load balancers. We are not going to look into that in this particular video. Another benefit that we have of using ingresses over services is we can include our own authentication mechanism, right? So for example, let's say if a request comes to, let's say, slash API's resource path, you want to have some authentication mechanism in place, so you can configure that as well, right? So these are some of the very basic things or very basic benefits that we have over the services of type NodePort and load balancer. Again, there are a lot of other benefits as well, but yeah, these are the ones that I have on top of my head as of now, right? Now, let's just go ahead and try to have a look into one Ingress resource, and then we would actually discuss about all the fields in that Ingress resource. So this is the official documentation. I can link it in the description. Let's just go ahead and try to copy this, right? And now I'm going to save it with the name ingress.yaml, right? And let's just go ahead and try to discuss about all the fields that we have here. So again, this entire thing is object metadata about object, and this is actual definition or actual specification of the Ingress resource. And we can clearly see that in the specification of resource, we are defining some rules, right? And this rules is a slice of HTTP paths we can see here, right? Now let's go ahead and try to look into all these things in more detail. So for example, we are defining some paths here, and first path is test path. So path simply means the resource path to which this particular rule would be applied to. So for example, if a request comes on this particular test path or this particular resource path, this particular rule would actually be applied, right? And if a particular request come to this particular resource path, which particular service is going to respond to that particular request is specified using backend, right? So it simply means that if a request comes to /test path, in that case the request would be forwarded to a service named test, right? And on the port number 80, right? And this is all in very basic terms. We can say that this is all that an Ingress provides us with, right? And we are going to look into path type in a bit, but yeah, if we leave path type behind for a second, path just specifies the resource path, right? And backend specifies the backend service that would be responding to the request that is coming to the test path, right? And this is a very simple example of an ingress, right? Now what we are going to do is we are going to actually deploy an application, and then we would expose that application using ingress resource, right? And then we are going to discuss about some other fields that are here, right? So the application that we are going to deploy is the application that we built in some of the previous videos. So hill install name of the application, and we are going to, let's say, install it in the lib namespace, and the application is this, right? And if I press enter, it should not be installed because lib namespace is not created. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and create the lib namespace, and now if I press enter, this should be deployed successfully, right? Yeah, here we go, and we should be able to see two namespaces being spinned up. And again, this is not going to work because the reason is by default the Helm uses a storage class named standard, and we don't have any storage class named standard here. So we will have to maybe upgrade this particular Helm that we have installed, Helm chart. So we can either upgrade this chart to specify the storage class that is present on this cluster, or we can recreate it, right? So let's just go ahead and try to delete this Helm chart, right? And we are going to reinstall it with the correct values. So these are all the values that are supported. Since this is DigitalOcean cluster, I know that the storage class that we have here is DO block storage, and the another field that we are going to set is, right? And now we should have this application up and running successfully. All right. Now, if we just go ahead and try to look into this particular ingress resource once again, and we look into the path type field that we have here, right? So there are some values that can be provided for this particular field, that is path type. One is prefix, the another one is, I think, exact, right? And the third one is ingress class, I think. So that depends on the ingress class that is created on the cluster. We are not going to look into ingress class as of now, because first, I'm also not very comfortable with ingress classes as of now. And yeah, if you want, maybe I can cover that in future videos. So we are just going to look into two things here: path type prefix, and the another would be path type exact, right? Okay. All right, so now that we can see we have this library application up and running, let's just go ahead and try to try to insert some dummy data into the database. And the password that we provided while installing application was secret password, right? And we are going to create a dummy database and just insert some records into that particular table, right? Now that we have inserted the data successfully, what I'm going to do is, so now if we want to access that data, what we can do is we will have to somehow forward the requests to this particular service, right? So one way that we know is we can just port forward localhost to this particular service, just to check the things are working as expected. All right, here we go. So we are able to see that data that we just have inserted as the response of this particular endpoint, right? But this is not how the application on the production environments are going to be deployed, right? So now what we want to do is we want to expose this particular application, right, using ingress resources. So we have a definition of ingress resource over here. So we are going to use this ingress resource, and we are specifying the path to be APIs, right? Because we can see that our application is exposed on APIs, right? And path type would be prefix, and we want to redirect the request to a service named REST API, right? So this is the service that we want to forward the request to in namespace REST API, right? So REST API and on port 8080. Let's name it REST API Ingress, and let's remove this as of now. We can discuss about this in maybe later videos, but shortly, this particular annotation specifies that no matter at which particular resource path the request is coming on, the pod that would be called, the request would be the request would go to a resource, to root resource path, let's say, right? So for example, even if we call /apis, when the pod is called, pod would be called with slash or root resource path. So we don't need that as of now. And this particular ingress is ready, I would say. So we want to get it created in the REST API namespace, right? So again, if we try to discuss about this particular resource, this resource just says that the request on API's resource path should be forwarded to REST API service in the REST API namespace. So it is going to forward the request to a service that is present in the same namespace on port 8080, right? So before creating this particular ingress, the other thing that I would like to discuss about is Ingress controllers, right? So if you don't have any Ingress controller installed on your Kubernetes cluster, creating Ingress resources are not going to help you in any way, right? So what we will have to do is we will have to actually install an Ingress controller, right? And that Ingress controller is actually going to resolve all these paths and every other thing, and that is the controller that is going to help us with all these things that we discussed about. For example, host based routing and authentication, for example, or let's say SSL termination, or the other thing that we discussed about, right? So we need a controller, right, that would be looking over the Ingress resources and then would be doing the things that are required. So there are a lot of available Ingress controllers, but we are going to use Nginx Ingress controller, right? And let's just go ahead and deploy it right away. So DigitalOcean, and this is all that we need to deploy a DigitalOcean controller on DigitalOcean cluster, right? It creates everything in the Ingress-Nginx namespace. So kubectl get all Ingress-Nginx, and we can see that it has created a service of type load balancer. Now, if you have seen one of my previous videos, we have actually discussed about this particular service in very detail, right? So one thing that I would like to highlight is we are not actually exposing our application, that is REST API, using load balancer service, right? We installed Ingress controller, and that Ingress controller is actually creating a load balancer service, right? And we can see that external IP has not yet been assigned, right, to this particular service. So let's just wait for some time so that an external IP is assigned to this particular service, right? And in meanwhile, let's just go ahead and try to discuss about the path types that we have here, right? So for example, our application is actually listening on the path APIs /v1/books, right? So since we have specified prefix here, right, this particular prefix would be checked in the incoming URL, right? So for example, this is the resource path. So the thing that we are going to check is APIs, right? So if /APIs is prefix of incoming URL, in that case we can say that it would be true or success, and the request would be forwarded to backend, right? But if we change this path type to be, let's say, exact, right, and in that case if a request comes with this particular resource path, controller would not actually forward that request to backend, because exact simply means that the path that is specified here should match with the path that is there in the request that is coming, right? So again, let me just go ahead and try to explain that one more time, right? So if we specify path type to be prefix, it simply means that this would be checked as prefix of the incoming URL, right? So for example, let's say a.b.c.d, right? And if this is the request, right, we are saying that /APIs should be prefix of the resource path, right? And which is true in this particular scenario, right? But if we say slash APIs should be exact resource path of the request. In that case, this would not be true, right? Because resource path is API slash v1 slash books, right? And this in that particular case, the request would not be forwarded to REST API. Maybe we would just go ahead and try to demo that as well, right? So these are two path types that I wanted to discuss. There is another one that would be dependent on Ingress class. Now that we have external IP here, let's just go ahead and try to access that, right? And it just says there is nothing found here. And even if we look for APIs v1 books, we cannot see anything, right? Now let's just go ahead and try to create the Ingress resource. So kubectl create and ingress.yaml, and if I hit enter, it simply says that this particular ingress has been created, right? And if I refresh this, we can clearly see that we are getting the same response that we got when we port forwarded to cluster IP service, right? Now this particular endpoint is publicly available and it can be shared with anyone that you want to, right? And they would be able to access your application using this particular endpoint, right? And yeah, I mean, so this is how we can use Ingress resources to actually expose your application from outside of your cluster, right? And this application can be accessed from anywhere that you want to, right? And the other thing that I would like to discuss about is, let's say if we want to show the other path type that is exact, right? And if we just go ahead and try to, first of all, I'm not very sure if the path type is exact. So what we can do is we can actually use kubectl explain to figure out details about a particular field. So what I'm going to do is kubectl explain spec.rules.http.paths. Let's say if this works. So explain ingress dot spec dot rules dot http dot and we want paths dot path type. Okay, so it says path type determines the interpretation of the path matching and exact is a value. All right, so it looks good to me. If I just go ahead and try to create the ingress once again. So since this resource is already existing, what we can do is we can apply to make changes or to update the resource. Now, if we just go ahead and try to describe the Ingress resource from REST API namespace, we can see that this is going to redirect the things from APIs to this particular service on port 8080, right? And if we just go ahead and try to refresh this once again, we see 404, right? And again, the reason is we have specified the path type to be exact. So /APIs is being matched in the incoming request, but in the incoming request we have API /v1/books, and that is the reason the request will not be forwarded to this particular service, and that's the reason we are getting 404, right? Now let's just go ahead and try to remove v1 books, and if we press enter here, so now here you can see that the response has been changed. Now let me tell you the reason. So the earlier 404 that we were giving was from the controller that we have installed, that is Ingress Nginx controller, right? Because because the request was not being forwarded to this particular service, because this particular check was not matched, right? But when we are making request to APIs, this particular check is matched and request is being forwarded to this particular service, but our application is not listening on this particular endpoint, right? So does that make sense? Let me explain that to you once again. So this is failing and we are getting 404, and the reason is Ingress controller is not able to figure out which particular service it should forward the request to, right? Because here we have specified this check that resource path should be the exact match of /APIs, right? And since we are specifying /APIs v1 books, it simply means that Ingress would not be able to forward that request to this particular backend because this particular check is not matching. Now, if we remove this particular check is being matched now, right? And the request is being forwarded to the REST API service, but our application is now saying that the application is not listening on this particular resource path, right? So this is the significance of path type field that we have for Ingress resources, right? Yeah, so let's just go ahead and try to correct this. Right, and now we should be able to list the things successfully, and here we go, right? So yeah, I mean, this is one thing that I wanted to discuss about Ingress resources. The other thing that I would like to discuss about is how we can actually use ingresses. What are some of the ways in which we can use ingresses, right? So if we take a look into the resource that we have here, right? So we can, as we can see here, we can specify the path, and if a request is coming to that particular path, which particular backend service should respond, right? Similarly, let's say we want to configure another path, right? And in that case, we can do that as well. So for example, let's say we want to listen on another path, right? And it would be, let's say, API / or let's say not books API, right? And in that case, what we can do is we can actually configure another backend, right? So let's say the service name would be another service and port would be another port, right? So it simply means that based on the resource path, you can actually specify the backend services that should respond to that particular resource path, right? So this is one way, and we call it, I think, simple fan out. If you look into the documentation, yeah. So these are ingress types, and we can see here, based on the resource path, we are redirecting the request to different backend services, and we call it simple fan out, right? And the other type is name based hosting, and that simply means we can actually specify the host as well, and if request is coming to a specific host, in that case that request would be served by a specific service, otherwise another service. So let's just go ahead and try to take a look into this particular example, right? So for example, what this says is, if request is coming on this particular host, HTTP request, right, on this particular path, this is the service that would respond to the requests, right? And similarly, if the request is coming from this particular host, right, this is the service that is going to respond to the requests. Now, so we can simply say that we are actually routing the requests based on the host, right? And this is called host-based routing. Now, this would be figured out from the HTTP header of the request, right? So when we make a request, we actually can see the HTTP header by going to the developer tools on Chrome, and we can actually try to figure out what is the value set for the host header field, right? So for example, if you just go ahead and try to uh, look into this call that we are making to books, we can actually see the headers here, and in request header we are able to see the host, right? So for example, let's say if this host is mapped to a particular domain name, right, that domain name would be set here, and from that is how Ingress controller is going to map the things to the host that is specified here, right? So yeah, I mean, this is another way. The other thing that we can do is very basic ingress that we have already created, that is an ingress that would just have single service. So this REST API service is actually responsible to serve all the requests that would be coming on this particular path, right? So this is another very basic example of the ingress resource, right? So yeah, another thing that I wanted to discuss about is, for example, you specify some rules, right? And for example, let's say you have specified more than one rules, right? And more than one rules are matching with the incoming request. So for example, let's say the path that we have specified, the other another path was v1/books, right? And the another one was API v1. So now we can see that slash APIs v1 books and APIs v1, all of these paths would be matching to the request that is coming, right? And in that case, this is one that would be preferred, right? And this is, or we can say, the longer match would be preferred if in case there are more than one rules that are matching with the incoming request, right? So yeah, I mean, this would be the case if there are n number of rules and more than one rule is matching with the incoming request. In that case, we can simply say that the longest match would actually be preferred, right? So yeah, I mean, this is pretty much it that I wanted to discuss about Kubernetes Ingress Resources. Again, if you like the videos, you can maybe consider subscribing. You can share it with your colleagues, your friends, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.